Good news for creators, free news for creators. The latest from Podnews.net with Magellan AI. Podcast hosting company Spreaker is now free, claiming it's the first ever professional level podcast platform to be available at no cost. Features like unlimited storage and programmatic monetization, previously only available in a $250 a month enterprise package from the iHeart-owned platform, are now free for all podcast creators. The release describes existing free alternatives as mediocre and very basic. We're linked to a deep dive today into their platform from Sounds Profitable. Well, through its parent Voxnest, Spreaker's technology powers some of the most prominent programmatic ad marketplaces in the podcasting industry. Itself, Spreaker is the number 3 podcast host, according to market share of new episodes, but its market share has declined from 8.4% a year ago to 5.4% last month. Podcast listening has hit record highs, according to the Infinite Dial from Edison Research. Here's Megan Lazovich.
We also asked, have you listened to a podcast in the last month? The good news for those in podcasting is that we're back on track. Monthly podcast listeners increased to 42% of the U.S. population. That's an estimated 120 million Americans aged 12 and older.
Weekly podcast listening also increased. You'll find an infographic with podcast data in our newsletter today. You can watch the webinar or download the full deck. All of that at podnews.net. Paid-for podcast host Libsyn released a financial statement for 2022 today. The podcast hosting and monetization platform says it made $58.7 million in revenue, including more than $33 million from advertising. Veritone also released that company's 2022 financial results. The company saw a revenue increase of 30% year-on-year. Marketing Brew covers a method that means advertisers can use their own first-party data to help target their podcast ads. Theoretically, it might mean that Geico Insurance can avoid advertising to new customers and target those who are close to renewal instead. The winners of the Spanish language 2023 Ondas World Podcast Awards were announced. There'll be a ceremony on May the 3rd in Malaga. And Eric Newsom advises us to learn lessons from Spotify rather than just whine about them. In podcast news, in the Podnews Weekly Review this week, details of beer in Las Vegas and a live taping of the show. And Steve Pratt joins Sam and I to talk about his role as an attention strategist.
It's a really high bar to earn attention. It's a tough message, but it's also the only message that matters, because I think there's so many people trying to do shortcuts and tricks. Lead with your empathy and values and think about the other people and set yourself a very high bar for quality to be able to actually be something special that's worth talking about.
Also in the Podnews Weekly Review, you can discover how to start using Podfans today. It's sponsored by Buzzsprout. And Podcast Bestie launches today from Courtney Kosak, and her first guest is me. I seem to like mentioning fish and chips a lot, it turns out.
Do you have any tips, dummy-proof tips, for podcasters and SEO? Is there anything else that you think people should be incorporating?
I mean, just on a really basic level, make sure that your podcast is called something which makes it obvious what the podcast is about. It's really easy for you to go, I'm writing a podcast about, fish and chips or something. So I'll call it, assault and battery. You know what I mean? And won't that be funny? And that'll be really, really hilarious. And then you wonder why no one finds your podcast. Nobody's found your podcast because it doesn't say a fish and chips podcast.
Exactly.
That's a very British reference. But you know what I mean?
This podcast is sponsored by Magellan AI. How's the podcast advertising market looking in 2023? You should join their session at Podcast Movement Evolutions in Las Vegas on March the 8th at 11 a.m. And if you can't make it, just follow the link from podnews.net/latest to get the latest from their blog. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.